Hi, my name is Lenore Reiser, and I'm here on behalf of the Ag Biodata Network Consortium. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is representing the Global Biodata Coalition. So the Global Biodata Coalition is working with funders to encourage more efficient collaboration in funding data resources and to sustain funding for critical data resources. And our speaker, Chuck Cook, I discovered he and I share a background of being from UC Berkeley. So he obtained his PhD from Berkeley, where he used molecular phylogenetics, yay, to study the evolution of Sitka deer. Following this, he moved on to the University of Cambridge for a series of postdoctoral research fellowships studying human mitochondrial variation, arthropod evolution using Hox genes, and complete mitochondrial sequences. And after that, he moved to the British Antarctic Survey to undertake biodiversity research on planktonic arthropods in the Southern Ocean, which is so cool, and I would love to hear just about that. Following this, he received an MBA from the University of Cambridge and joined the EMBL EBI, where he worked on various internal projects and a number of European grants, including those supporting the growth and development of Elixir, which some of you may know about. And he is currently now the program manager for the Global Biodata Coalition. And so he's going to tell us about that project and that work now. So thank you, and everybody get muted and we'll get started.
Oh, okay, thanks. This is just the title slide. We can go to the next one. Right. This slide notwithstanding, most of this is a pretty text-heavy presentation. I apologize for that, but it's designed so that when it's distributed afterwards, there's a little bit of content in it. So today I'm just going to introduce the Global Biodata Coalition and tell you about what we're doing, and in particular focus on the concept of core data resources, which some of you may have heard about before. And if not, I'll tell you about them. So I wanted to begin here by introducing the idea of science infrastructures. The one on the left there is the Large Hadron Collider. The one on the right is the Diamond Light Source in Oxfordshire in the UK. Most of the science infrastructures we think about are these sort of large construction projects here. You can basically put a fence around them. There's a lot of concrete, there's a lot of metal. It's pretty easy to understand what has been built. They're quite expensive, but once they're built, you can see them. The government knows what, or whoever's paid for it knows what's been built. Can we go to the next slide? But there are other kinds of infrastructures, distributed infrastructures, where the bits of the infrastructure are all over the place. And the life science data resources, which is the worldwide collective set of databases and data resources for life sciences, is a distributed infrastructure. And these are, probably this audience knows, repositories for data. They provide added value curation. They're absolutely essential for the research effort worldwide now. Everyone uses them in life sciences, biotech, agriculture, as you know. The research infrastructure depends upon these data resources. But the challenge here is, first of all, that they rely on a very small number of funding programs and a small number of funders to fund the very large and important resources. And the other challenge is conceptual. It's hard to see this as an infrastructure. It's just, as I said, distributed around the world. It's groups of people in laboratories, sometimes in large institutions, who are running a single database. The hardware for storing the information might be somewhere else, might be in the same building, could be rented. So it's quite difficult to get a handle on the costs of the infrastructure, on the usage of the infrastructure, and even what it looks like. Somewhat amorphous. Next slide. So first, I should say that I did work at EMBL EBI previously, so these examples are from EMBL EBI, but they pertain to everything. And the data resources are all interconnected. I'm sure you're all aware of this, but if you look on the left side, the Circos plot, those are all the data resources at EMBL EBI. And the lines between them are measuring data flows. That is, when they're exchanging data, the name of a species, a gene sequence, a taxonomy, any kind of data flow is measured there. And you can see that even within the resources at MBLI, which is unusual because it's a large institution with many data resources, they're all talking to each other. Now, on the right-hand side is our attempt to do the same map for the global relationship between EBI resources on the right-hand side and all of the other resources which it talks to on the left-hand side. And there are 1,000 different links there. And we know that this is actually a lower estimate. There are many more links. These are only the ones that EBI resources know about. So the point here is this is what makes all of the data resources globally an infrastructure. They're all tied together. They're all exchanging information, and they're important. The relationship between them is important. Next slide, please. Right. So how large is this infrastructure? Well, really, we don't know. At least 3,000 data resources have been created. Could be many more, and it also depends on how you define what is the data resource. There are very large resources, GenBank, PDB, the ones in AgBiodata, those are clearly data resources. But what about something that's created by a single graduate student in a laboratory? But there's a website and it's open to the world. Do we count that or not? I don't have an answer for that, but it's a difficult, measuring the infrastructure is difficult. There are at least 100 new resources created per year, and that's based upon the number of resources which publish a paper that says, hey, we're here, we're a new resource, here we are. What is spent on maintaining and building resources? Again, we don't know. My guesstimate here is that it's about $500 million US per year. But that sounds like a lot, but that's spread over the entire globe. And it's far less than the amount of money spent to generate the data that goes into the resources, which is probably 1,000 times that. But again, that's an estimate. One of the things GBC would like to do is put better figures on this number, on these numbers. Next slide, please. So apologies for all the text here, but we want to lay the groundwork here for what we're doing. Biodata resources are vulnerable. I'm sure all of you are aware of that. And in fact, I'd be curious to hear from you. There's exponential data generation, so it's putting pressure on the resources. Open access policies, both from funders and from journals, are increasing demand. New technologies are coming online that require new data resources. That puts pressure on what's essentially a finite funding stream. Data resources are an infrastructure. Infrastructures require long-term funding, but as most of you are probably aware, data resources themselves tend to have short-term funding. They're treated often almost as grants and are on 3 or 5 year funding cycles, which is difficult to sustain. There isn't a lot of coordination among funders globally, so some of them may be funding the same kinds of data resources, which is given a finite amount of money, not efficient. In some cases, resources could lose their funding and they could disappear, and that could be really bad depending on how important that resource is. It would certainly be bad for whoever is using it. And there's a risk of retreating behind paywalls, which as we know, has already happened. Retreat behind a paywall is not necessarily terrible. It can work quite well. But as we've just seen, there are thousands of resources, and if they all retreated behind a paywall, it would be somewhat chaotic for the scientists who try to figure out which ones they really needed. Next slide. So these problems that I've just described are not new. Funders have recognized them for some time. And obviously data resource managers recognize them as well. So starting 5, 6, 7 years ago, some of the funders have been talking about how to tackle the challenges of funding the infrastructure. This was kind of the beginning of the first publication on this from NIH, but it was supported by many people. Next slide. Right, so this is just a blow up of one of the paragraphs there. And I've put a little bar there. The first step for funding agencies to communicate more effectively about data science problems and to seek collaborative solutions. So that's effectively the beginning of the Global Biodata Coalition. So can we have the next slide, please? So beginning just after that paper was published in 2015, so around 2016, some of the funders and large data resource managers in NCBI, EBI, began having meetings to try to figure out how to attack the problem of sustainable funding and funding the resources as an infrastructure. And out of this grew the Global Biodata Coalition. And here's a paper that was published 4 years ago now, almost 4 years ago now, describing the need to have a coalition. So next slide, please. Right. So the Global Biodata Coalition was formed just after that. And as with many things, it wasn't formed de novo instantly. It kind of grew over time. And the goal of the GBC is to ensure the sustainability of the biodata infrastructure and the continued access to data by scientists. The scope of the GBC is at the moment only on unrestricted open access data resources. So we are, for the moment, not looking at anything that requires consent to access. That will probably come later, but it's just a bit too complicated at present. There are many benefits, we think, to the GBC, preventing data loss, coordinating the funding and the ecosystem of data resources, reducing redundancy, strengthening coordination among funders globally. We want to provide opportunities for additional funders to support data resources. I mentioned earlier that many of the data resources are supported by a relatively small number of funders. We want to encourage funders who are not currently supporting the resources to fund resources. That doesn't mean they will fund existing resources, but there are always opportunities for new things. And in that way, to reduce the dependency on a small number of funders. Okay, next slide. Right, again, apologies for so much text, but there's only a couple more like this. So what are we doing? We are going to encourage global coordination and knowledge exchange. The focus here is on funders. We are supported by the funders, and the main purpose is to enable funders to share strategies, to improve coordination, to identify new funding opportunities, to share expertise, and to leverage national expertise that is inside of one country or one location globally, and to promote national or local participation in the adoption of standards for data management. Next slide. So this slide is from Eric Green, who's the head of NHGRI and one of the key players who's in establishing the Global Biodata Coalition. And this is his vision of what the GBC is doing. So the airplanes are the funders, and before establishing the GBC, they're flying around funding the resources, but not really paying any attention to each other. And afterwards, we hope that they will coordinate spending globally and effectively thereby increase the funding for resources. There won't necessarily be more money in aggregate, but we hope it will be more efficiently spent. Next slide. So this is just the governance slide. At the moment, we have a secretariat, which is virtual. In other words, we don't have an office. That was true even before COVID. And COVID has just extended the amount of time when we will have a virtual secretariat because we can't really do anything now about finding a home. The Human Frontier Science Program is our initial host, and by host, what we mean is they're managing the money. We are supported by a group of research funders, and I'll show the support slide at the end, and led by a board of those research funders. We are undertaking outreach to stakeholders, and this talk is one of those. We, as I said, we're supported by funders, but we want to make sure that stakeholders, which are people who run data resources and scientists, as well as funders who aren't current members, understand and support what we're doing. So we're always happy to have feedback, always happy to be invited to talk somewhere else, and always happy to have a chat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing scientifically. And the caveat here is at the moment, we actually only have one employee, which is me. We are expanding as rapidly as we can. We just got some more funding in, but because of COVID, it's somewhat of a challenge to hire at the moment. So we'll get there eventually. So the programmatic activities are coordination, and then there's a science program. So let's go to the next slide. So coordination is what we're calling stakeholder engagement. These are the stakeholders here: data producers, data users, data resource managers, other research funders, as I just said. And we're doing as much outreach as we can. And even though I'm the only employee, we have other people involved. There's a steering group and a board of funders, so other people are doing things. So we are intending to hold meetings to share information among funders. Later on this year, we will probably host some virtual meetings to explain core data resources, which I'll talk about in a minute. We will do publications and we will do presentations. We have a Twitter feed, we have a LinkedIn, all the usual social media. Next slide. So the basic questions for the scientific program are: how can biodata resource infrastructure be managed for the benefit of everyone? An even more basic question is, what is the infrastructure? And that's coming back to the question of what is a data resource? How many resources are there? Where are they? How do we define the components? And then a bigger question, which of course is much harder to solve, is what is the value of the infrastructure? Funders are putting a lot of money into supporting data resources. Many millions of scientists are using them. But how do we assess the utility, the economic value, the value in saved time of these resources? Now, I don't expect to have an answer to that anytime soon, but it's a long-term question that we'd like to address. Next slide. Overview of our scientific program. So the first thing we want to do is to describe the infrastructure. So question one, what is the total global spending on life sciences? And what is the total spending on biodata resources? And this is an exceedingly difficult question to answer. I don't think we'll have an answer to this very soon. It's quite difficult. And I'm happy to talk about why it's difficult at other times, but effectively, the funders don't report the information in a way that is easily sliceable and compilable. A more concrete question: how many data resources are there? That's actually not too hard to do, we think. If we limit it to data resources which have published something that says have written a publication that says here we are, or otherwise done something very obvious to make themselves noticeable. And then what are funders' strategies for supporting data resources? And I should also say policies there. So we've already started asking our board of funders members about their strategies and policies, and we're trying to understand how we can make this information available more widely, both to the funders themselves and also to the greater community. It may be that we have meetings that address these questions as well. And then the other big thing we're doing is identifying global core data resources. So the next few slides describe those. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the concept of core data resources was pioneered by Elixir in Europe. Most of you some of you may be familiar with Elixir, but it's within Europe. It's a research infrastructure comprised of national biodata resource, what are called nodes, which have grouped together and try to manage resources, life science data resources within Europe collectively. Something like what Global Biodata Coalition does, but there's a much greater emphasis in Elixir on training and developing standards and actually doing the nitty-gritty technical work of managing data resources. Those aspects of Elixir Global Biodata Coalition won't be addressing. So the core data resources idea was to come up with a set of data resources that are fundamentally important to the broad life science community and the long-term preservation of data. So they are also represent complete collections of generic value, and they have high levels of usage, scientific quality and service in quotes. And there's let's go to the next slide. What I want to say is on the next slide. Right. Oh, sorry. There's a paper that I'll show you in a minute that will that explains how that works. So why focus on core data resources? Core data resources are, as defined, fundamental for the entire global infrastructure. They're analogous to keystone species in an ecosystem. And so the focus on core data resources will help protect the entire global infrastructure. And practically speaking, it's not possible to focus on every data resource. So what we're going to do is to select globally a set of core data resources, which are really the nodes in the interlinking web of resources that I showed earlier. And this concept is very strongly supported by the funders, and was one of the key reasons the Global Biodata Coalition was set up. Next slide, please. Right. So these two papers describe how Elixir is selecting core data resources. Now, the challenge for Elixir in selecting core data resources in Europe is that, as we've just seen, data resources are global. So selecting only resources in Europe that are important is somewhat artificial. These resources that have been selected by Elixir many of them are coalitions, members of coalitions or collaborations that involve resources in other countries, in other regions. And all of them are heavily interconnected with data resources all over the world. So it's a somewhat a stilted selection here to only pick ones in Europe. So we want to extend the program and do it globally. So if you want to find out more about these, here are the two papers that explain how they've been identified. And the second paper is a post selection analysis of the some of the key value points of the core data resources selected by Elixir. For instance, how many people use them, how large the data resources are, how many times they've been cited in the literature, etc. Next slide. So the selection process for core data resources is under development. It will be a two-stage process. First, we will ask for expressions of interest, which will be 1 or 2 pages. There will be eligibility criteria, which we have not written yet, but some of them are already known. Examples will be, for instance, must be open access. So anything that requires any sort of has a paywall or requires subscription wouldn't be eligible. Would probably have a scientific advisory committee. Would probably have been in existence for some time. We haven't defined how long, but we want established resources here. These will be very large resources used by a large cross-section of the life sciences community. So not something that is used only by a very small group of people studying one organism or one particular kind of, I don't know, enzyme or something. Once we have solicited expressions of interest, we will do a shortlist. Selection from the shortlist will be very similar to a grant application. We will invite longer applications. There will be a review panel. The review panel will look at multiple indicators and select global core data resources. Now, other key points here are that the selection of global core data resources is not a one-off event. It will be regular, probably every 2 or 3 years, which is about the frequency that that is practical to run. I've seen questions pop up, but I'll answer them shortly. And I think I'll stop there, and then we'll answer questions. I know there will be many questions about the global core data resources selection. The short answer to most of them is that we're still developing everything. A longer answer is that the second part 2 here, selection from the shortlist, will be very similar to the Elixir program. And it is likely that we will only select a very small number in the first selection round, maybe 20, maybe 25, maybe only 15. But other than that, we don't have any more details. We will be running webinars or virtual seminars as soon as we have everything put together. And we will run those in multiple time zones, or multiple times, so that people in every time zone will have the opportunity. So basically, we'll run the same one 3 or 4 times in different time slots. Right. So I think that's the end. Let's go to, I think the next slide is the end slide. Oh, no, sorry. This is just a very brief overview of the kinds of indicators that we would look at in selecting the core data resources. There's a more detailed description in the Elixir paper. We will not duplicate the Elixir process identically, but will no doubt be very similar, because these indicators are basically the kinds of things we want to look at. And I think that's the last one. So go to the next one. Funders, yeah. So these are our current, we're currently getting financial support from the ones under current funding. And we are getting in-kind support from HFSP, MLEBI, SIB, and Elixir. And there are, in addition, not listed here, there are about 6 or 7 more large funders, for instance, the European Commission, INSERM, who are observers, and we hope will join within the next couple of years, but haven't quite joined, or I should say, we'll hope will start giving us money in the next few years. Right. So I can answer questions now, but maybe it would help if someone could moderate the questions for me.
Yeah, I was asked that people put their questions in the chat and just post to everybody. So there's a question from Tanya about once you are selected, so once you're selected as a GBC resource, what does that mean? Is that access to funding? What do you get?
It certainly doesn't mean access to funding. We have no money to give to anybody. The short answer is probably that you'll get a little logo to put on your website. The longer answer is that some funders, but not all, and if you're lucky, it will be one of yours, will look at that as a vote of confidence in your resource, and they may be inclined to continue your funding for longer. We don't know. NIH is certainly quite keen to have some of its resources made as global core data resources, so they can have a sort of neutral neutral support for the resource. In Europe, some of the core data resources themselves have told Elixir that being named a core data resource was useful in talks with their funding bodies. So at the moment, those are the things that might be useful. And we have been asked this question many times, and we are trying to collect more information from the core data resources in Europe to see how beneficial it has been to them. So great question. We have some answers, and we are not entirely sure yet what the full ramifications are.
All right, so another question is from Marianne McDowell, which is just to clarify about whether these core resources will be in addition to the Elixir selections.
Well, they'll be independent of them. So it's just
right.
it's a completely new. I think. Well, in the long term, it may be that Elixir, if we start doing this, Elixir may stop, but I don't know. Now, having said that, I mean, it's quite likely that many of the ones in Elixir would end up being selected as global ones, but we don't know that. The process will be independent. It'll be different people doing it. So,
Marianne, did that answer your question? I saw you have your hand up. So, did you want to just follow up?
Oh no, sorry. I put my hand up earlier. I just didn't take it down. But I did have another one in the chat. I just wanted, first of all, thank you for opening it up where people can submit for consideration. I think that's fabulous. I'm from ViewPathDB/VectorBase. It's part of an NIA-IID Bioinformatics Resource Center. And just they're refusing to let us publish about our resources. So if you're looking to identify some through publication, some funders aren't letting us publish.
Well, there wouldn't be no. We would that wouldn't be a yes or no criterion. It's just one of the things we look at is number of citations if there's a publication.
Okay, great.
Another thing that's looked at. Well, this is all for Elixir. We haven't decided, of course, for GBC, but another thing that was looked at was citations of accessions. But of course, that's only relevant for data resources which have citable accessions. Some of them are more added value, so that's not relevant. Yeah, so the challenge here is that almost every indicator you can think of doesn't apply to some resources. That's why it's so challenging. You can't just define a set of metrics and give a cutoff number. In every case, well, some of them there's no number; it's more qualitative. And even in cases where there's a quantity, for some of them it's not relevant. You can measure the amount of data downloaded from a resource, but that doesn't necessarily give you any indication of its value or utility. Because sometimes resources have giant data sets which are downloaded. So it makes it look like it's giant, but it could be 1 7 petabyte data set downloaded a month. So yeah, that's the whole challenge to the selection process. Other questions?
Yeah, so Effie asked the question about how will the collection of core resources be managed? It seems possible, depending on the selection criteria, that funding could be reduced or withdrawn or replaced by a different resource.
Okay, so the Global Biodata Coalition doesn't manage the funding at all. This is up to whoever's funding it now. So I mean, really, the answer to that is that we're trying to help the funders here to understand the shape and three-dimensional structure of the data infrastructure of the global infrastructure. How they choose to then to deal with that, to use that information is hard to say. Having said that, though, the funders that have joined the Global Biodata Coalition are keen to to use the information to help guide their funding decisions. And I don't mean that they will only fund core data resources and cut everybody off. What they want to understand is the sort of map, three-dimensional map of the infrastructure, and try to identify what really needs long-term funding, what might be shared, where are there opportunities for funders not currently really supporting data resources to help the system, to contribute to the system.
Yep. My question is more, you have a list of core resources. How are you going to manage that list?
How are we going to manage the list?
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you what Elixir does is that every year or two they review the entire thing, and just to make sure that the resources that are currently on the list still meet their criteria.
Okay. Yeah, I was a little concerned that you would have
because
you're always on the list.
Yeah, that's a life cycle question. Okay. So resources do go, they die or they merge or whatever, or maybe they get defunded and go away for that reason. So yes, there's a sort of review process.
So we have a question from Pankaj, and I just want to clarify that the video recording for the presentation will be available from the Ag Biodata website. I think everything gets posted on YouTube, and I think the slides will also be available. So the follow-up question is that where would one find information about where to apply an enrollment application to apply to be one of these resources?
Okay, so at the moment it's nowhere because we haven't even really developed it at all. This is all, this is what our plan is. When it's all set up, which we hope will be in the next 6 months or so, we will publicize it widely. For instance, through biocuration, on our Twitter feed, all the newsletters we know about, and given that the funders who are supporting us are NIH and NSF and many large funders in Europe and Asia, they will also distribute the information. So and in fact, I'll send it to Ag Biodata because I now know what you are. So that's how we'll distribute the information. And we have actually had discussions about this, and there was some concern that we wouldn't get to everyone who needs to know, but after discussing it internally, we realized that we probably would pretty much hit everyone.
So I have a question from Suk about the sort of relative importance of activity. So would you say the most important activity of the GBC is in selecting core resources? And maybe a follow-up I would add to that is that just sort of like relative to like right now, this is what's important, and then, as things accelerate, you move more into standards and some of these other activities?
Yeah, so, well, a good question, which I can't really answer. At the moment, yes, the core data resources is what we're focusing on because the funders want it, and it's something which is fairly concrete and we can do fairly quickly. My personal feeling is that in the longer term, it may be that the coordination among funders and getting the funders to share policies and strategies in understanding the need to support over the long term the whole infrastructure, that may end up being slightly more of a focus, but that's just my own personal feeling. That wouldn't be for quite a while though.
Seems like there's a lot of value in sort of like making it a lot less haphazard. And as your slide pointed out, sort of having some actual mission control as a bunch of like, shooting paper airplanes into the sky. Yeah,
I mean, we've already seen that just in the board meetings. The funders really are getting a lot just out of the board meetings and talking to each other.
All right. Are there other questions? Oh, okay. There's a question from Pankaj about just to clarify the definition of a core versus other collections. So there's core resources and then other.
Well, resources? we don't have a name for everything else. There will be core resources and then other things.
Important stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions that people have for Chuck?
Hi, this is Sushma. I have a question. I had the impression that Elixir in Europe is also advocating for the separate core funds for data resources that are not part of the other grant funds. Do you plan to do something like that, or have the recommendations on those lines?
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't. Elixir is.
So Elixir, one of the long-term goal of the Elixir was to advocate for a separate funding for the databases and resources that is not included, say, for example, along with the other research funding.
Oh yes, yeah, that's a sort of key. Well, we haven't made it an explicit goal, but it's an implicit goal here that data resources will be treated as infrastructure, not as research funding. So there would be separate funding streams for data resources, and we hope they would be longer lived, so they wouldn't have to reapply every 3 years. As you know, a data resource gets going, and it needs secure funding for as long as possible. And having to reapply for money every 3 years is just a huge time sink for the managers of the data resource. And in some cases, they have to demonstrate, novelty or new things. But that's not actually what a data resource should be doing. It shouldn't have to do something new every 3 years. It may be that it, as a source of deposited data, it doesn't want to change that much over time. So yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah, thank you. And the other thing is that also, like, for example, in biocuration and certain tools that we develop, they could be short term, not the long term. So how do we differentiate? And we're people who are looking for a small tools or a small biocuration project. Should they? Where should they apply for?
Okay, well,
how do we separate that?
Yeah, we haven't. That's kind of a lower level problem than what the GBC is looking at. We haven't really looked at tools at all, or analytical tools. It might be something we want to look at in the future. Elixir does look at tools and software, but the question you asked about short term versus long term also applies to data resources. Some data resources start out not intending to become part of the infrastructure, just something created as a research project, and they grow. Some don't grow, and or when they're created, they know there will be a finite lifespan. And how to fund one type versus the other, whether it's a tool or resource, is a challenge. So I guess I haven't really answered the question, but it's a tough question.
To perhaps discuss.
Thanks, Sushma. Thank you. So I guess one other follow-up question, and Pankaj asked this as well, is like sort of how can we help you from our perspective? It sounds like a lot of our interests are aligned. We have a lot of the same kinds of concerns, like sort of overall questions about defining value and so forth. So are there ways in which we as the Ag Biodata Consortium can work with the GBC?
Yeah, well, in the longer term, what we intend to do is hold actual real in-person plenary meetings that last for a day or two. So participation in those, and we will develop the idea behind those. We haven't planned any yet, but the idea would be to get funders and data resource managers and some users together to discuss policy, to discuss strategy and funding. To discuss how to measure the value of these things, how to measure the importance. So participating in those. In the nearer term, I think when we do have the core data resources expressions of interest, give us feedback on what, even if you don't apply yourself as your resource, you can give us feedback and say, hey, this looks really interesting, it's quite clear, or it's not clear. We like it, we don't like it. Any way you can contribute. Participate in meetings, other meetings. If you see us giving a talk, do come along, listen, ask questions, and then you can invite us to give more talks too, in other places. I need to reemphasize that we are just getting started. We don't have a lot of staff at the moment. We don't have a lot of time, but we will grow, hopefully, probably more after COVID ends. So, and more things will start coming out.
So if I may add, this is Pankaj here. Excellent talk and nice discussion over here. I think my question was also extending to means, as you just mentioned, there are limited resources on your end, but there is a big amount of interest in Europe already. And there are a few agencies from US, and many of us do interact directly with them. So maybe there's something distribution of work and delegation that, hey, can you guys go and work on the plant and the crop and agriculture side and motivate your agencies to be part of this global alliance, and how can we pull it off?
That's actually an excellent point. We are looking for more funders to join. Now, in the US, we've already got NSF and NIH and also Chan Zuckerberg in the picture. So I don't even know what the other funders are in the US. Maybe USDA. I don't know if they would want. Yeah, we haven't approached. Yeah, we haven't approached them at all, and I don't actually know why. Probably a time problem. Yes, but if you want to raise the GBC with USDA and let them know we're here, we're happy to talk to them. And of course, we can put them in touch with the people at NSF and NIH who are on our board as well. So, and also there's some Canadian funders involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wonderful.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that there's people within this group who are funded from the USDA and also from the Department of Energy, and so I think that we can use that those connections.
Yeah, DOE. I used to live near the Joint Genome Initiative, or I visited it. So I know they fund a lot of relevant data generating things as well. So that would be another good one.
Okay. So maybe an action item for us is to provide you with that list of contacts. And I think I have like one final question from Suk, which is who constitutes the GBC committee funders, resource managers, or data producers?
Well, the funders are effectively anyone who wants to join, with the caveat or requirement is they have to pay into the system. So it's kind of like there's an annual membership contribution. And of course, since they're giving us money, it's hard to refuse. We haven't ever turned anyone down. The data resource managers and users is anyone who manages a data resource, and users is effectively all life scientists. I don't think I've ever met anyone who doesn't use at least one data resource. There may be a few.
Yeah, I wrote the question wrong. So my question is, who constitutes the GBC committees? Are they funders or database resource managers?
So what do you mean? What do you mean by?
I think you mentioned that you are the only employee, but then you have committee members.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So we have right now there's an informal steering committee, which is managing the Global Biodata Coalition. There's an almost 100% overlap between that steering committee and funders who are paying in. So most of them are board members. But there's a couple of people, for instance, the head of Elixir, who've been involved very early. So that's the committee. These are just data resource managers and a few funders who are actively involved in getting the GBC going.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to close up for the questions now. I think if there's more, maybe people can contact Chuck directly. Again, the slides will be available, and the recording of the talk will be available. And if that's all, and there's no other business, then I really wanted to thank Chuck for a really exciting and informative presentation. And we look forward to future interactions.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. And I realized I neglected to put my email address on the slide deck, but it will be. When you distribute it, please make it available. And you can always go to our website and click on the contact It doesn't actually come to my email address, but it's an email address that I monitor, so I'll see it.